Often when we think of environmental challenges and questions, the first place we jump to is the global with climate change or major issues like hurricanes and other large-scale disasters. But it's the actions we can take, sometimes in our own backyard and almost always in our own community, that can make immediate and impactful impacts that transform the lives of not only ourselves and our families, but those around us in profound ways. Today we're sitting down with a researcher and an urban planner who's been doing exactly that kind of work here in Houston, helping to reinvigorate communities through the creation of new park space and community resources, all tied to reimagining what public health and urban planning might bring us when we invest in our local resources. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Associate Director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Edward Pettitt is a doctoral student in urban planning and environmental policy at Texas Southern University in the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice, and a leading figure in urban planning around Houston, really in particular thinking about local communities and how to build them to be healthier, safer, and more environmentally friendly. And I'm delighted to welcome him, along with our researcher Neiman Rensdorf, today for a conversation all about his work and in particular the Columbia Tap Trail. Ed Pettitt, welcome to the program.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Thanks. We're delighted to have you here. I've been wanting to chat with you for a while about a range of projects you're up to, especially here in Houston, but also globally, and in particular the Columbia Tap Trail. But I'm going to let you get into all that. But first, I'm going to turn things over to our researcher, Neiman, who's going to start off for us.
Hi, yeah. So for audience members who might not be familiar with the Friends of the Columbia Tap, can you kind of give them an insight into what the organization is and what you do?
So it dates back to when I first moved to Houston. I had completed a tour of service with the U.S. Peace Corps in Botswana. I ended up joining Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital with their pediatric HIV initiative in Botswana, and they recruited me to come to Houston. So I looked online, Craigslist at the time, for a room that was affordable for someone about to start a master's degree after spending the last 4 years volunteering, basically.
I remember that Craigslist search from when I did my master's in Houston.
Right. And so I found a room in the kind of Riverside Terrace neighborhood, and it was close to the medical center, and I reserved it sight unseen. And from day one in January 2011, when I flew into Houston, I went straight to the residence and got to know the Third Ward neighborhood. And that home was a block away from this hike and bike trail. And I was always trying to use Google Maps to find ways to get places, and it would always take me through the trail. And I was studying public health at the time, and so it was curious to me that I didn't seem to see a lot of residents from Third Ward using that trail. And so I actually did a GIS project, a Geographic Information Systems Mapping project for my public health GIS class, looking at rates of childhood obesity and other indicators of hike and bike trail networks. And I realized that the neighborhood wasn't seeing the health benefit of having such a nice linear trail. And when I looked at the design of it, I saw that it was physically separated from the neighborhood by drainage ditches. And I said, well, this is not just a public health problem, it's an infrastructure problem. And I started reading up on these things. I learned about redlining, I learned about highway construction, and I learned about the history of that trail itself, which was a rail trail. It was a former railroad. And that railroad was built initially pre-Civil War in 1856. And it was built in two sections for two different purposes, and eventually those two sections met up. At the time, Houston and the business leaders there at the confluence of Buffalo Bayou and White Oak Bayou, they were vying for influence with Harrisburg for trade on the Buffalo Bayou. And there was already a pre-existing railroad, kind of the first railroad in Texas, the Buffalo Bayou Brazos Railroad, that extended from Richmond to Harrisburg. And the business interests in this small town of Houston were jealous. And so they built a railroad to tap into that rail. It's called the Houston Tap. That same year, just within a few months, the plantations in Brazoria County, they wanted to find a way to get their sugar and cotton to Houston and onwards to the port of Galveston in a faster, more efficient way. They had to take it with donkeys and carts through mud and rivers. And they started building their own rail using their enslaved labor. And eventually those two sections met up and became the Houston Tap and Brazoria Railway. And I'll fast forward to today. We can go back to the history if you want, but it's a long history. When it became a trail and I saw that there was really no advocacy around it, there were two kind of wooden kiosks at each end that were empty. There was nothing telling the history of it. I reached out to different organizations, and I initially got support from a coalition called Healthy Outdoor Communities, which had funding from the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health to do projects that improved green space access in low-income communities of color to improve mental health outcomes. And so I pitched the idea of doing a neighborhood festival, kind of a big block party with resources and exhibitors about health, with bike rides, with giving bicycles and helmets away to kids, and trying to create more of a connection and awareness of the trail in the Third Ward community. And we had that festival in 2022. And this past year, last month, we had our 4th annual festival. And it was after that first festival that residents would come up and say, we never realized this trail was here, the history of it, like we need to make this an annual festival. And I said, okay, well, let's make a group called Friends of Columbia Tap, and that's how Friends of Columbia Tap was born. And we've been a very grassroots organization for the past few years working under fiscal agents. This year, for the first time, we have our 501c3 status, so that's a big milestone for
Congrats.
us. Thank you.
So I want to let Naman jump in with what I'm sure are a bunch of follow-ups on Columbia Tap Trail in general. But first, I think this migration from public health to now you're pursuing a doctorate in urban planning, makes total sense in the kind of framing of thinking about infrastructure as a public health issue, but probably not outside of urban planning nerds and planners themselves.
Yeah.
A frame that a lot of folks immediately jump to in thinking about the way that we actually design the places we live having really profound impacts on our health. So can you talk just a little bit more about the way broadly that urban planning really does impact and shape our physical and mental health? I mean, you've already given some examples here, but maybe a little more broad scope on just how those two things are linked.
Right. Well, urban planning was actually born out of public health. Urban planning really started when you had these big cities coming up in the early 1800s, like New York City, having waste management problems. And people were, throwing waste outside their windows and, tracking mud and disease in. And you had in London, you had these waterborne illnesses being spread because of the water quality. And those were urban planning challenges, and they didn't really have that profession at the time, but it started off in the sanitation department of how do we lay out our drinking taps and our sewage plan and our drainage plan, and how do we keep our roads maintained and do trash pickup. Like that all started out of the sanitation arena. And for me, it's kind of always so interspersed that I almost have to step back and force myself to parse out how other people might see it. But for me, it's always intertwined. Like even yesterday, I was at an energy conference at Texas State University, and we were talking about renewable energy and microgrids as a method for mitigating power outages during storms. And for me, that's a public health problem because Winter Storm Uri, we had over 240 people die throughout the state of Texas, and 2/3 of those were from hypothermia because they couldn't access warming, and also from carbon monoxide poisoning because they brought in their gas heaters and generators into their homes. And then last year with Hurricane Beryl, we had residents, mostly seniors, dying from hyperthermia, from heat stress and stroke. And even apart from natural disasters, our cities are just getting hotter, and there's design answers to that public health challenge. And so all of these issues, whether it's COVID or natural disasters, to me, they're always a blend of public health, urban planning, and environmental issues. So that's kind of how I approach things.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and kind of jumping back to your previous answer, I know you mentioned the trail's history and status as kind of a landmark for the community. Can you kind of explain how the history of the trail as a rail trail informed your goals for the Columbia Tap, for the Friends of the Columbia Tap, and what your goals are going forward?
I've always been a history buff. I grew up in upstate New York, near Niagara Falls, not too far from Buffalo. And I grew up in a rural area that was settled by Quakers. And Quakers throughout the 1800s were abolitionists, and they also took part in facilitating the Underground Railroad, especially because that particular community where I grew up is right next to the Niagara River, a popular crossing point to get into Canada to freedom. And so I spent my summers as a tour guide on a farm that was part of the Underground Railroad, learning about the intersection of agriculture and the Atlantic slave trade and the Underground Railroad. And so I kind of always looked at the historical underpinnings of things. And for me, I went back and looked at the history of the Columbia Tap and the railroad. And it's called the Columbia Tap, by the way, because the town in Brazoria County, where it starts from, is the town of Columbia. And so people just shortened it to Columbia Tap. The other nickname of the railroad was the Sugar Road because of all of the sugar that it transported. At the time, Brazoria County was the center of the sugar bowl. It was the wealthiest county in all of Texas. And so I paired up with a historian and educator named Naomi Carrier, and she's really done a great job of compiling and interpreting this history of the railroad. And so we want that to translate into the future of the trail. And how do we take this railroad of extraction and transform it into a trail of reconciliation, of reconciling with that history of the railroad, of the extraction, and even the environmental justice issues of the communities that lived along an active railroad. And the fact that in 1985, when that railroad was decommissioned by Union Pacific, the then owner, they just left it as a barren corridor, a scar through the neighborhood that filled up with illegal dumping and crime and decay. And residents had to take it upon themselves in the mid-1980s to clean it up. The city wasn't paying attention to it. The railroad company had sold the metal for scrap and were done with it. And it wasn't until early 2000s that the city started the process to transform it into a trail. But by then, those residents already had a vested interest in it. And so you have to look at the history to understand the present and to inform the future.
Can you talk any about, I talked with Naomi some before about her work, especially around this trail. I'm curious if there's anything that she found or that in your own research or that with working with other folks locally has really just stood out as like significant stories, markers of this history that, or things that you hear from community members they really want shared and understood about the history of the place.
Naomi frames the history of the railroad as from dirt to shirt. This railroad really exemplifies how enslaved labor plantation economies fueled the Industrial Revolution. That cotton from Brazoria County shipped on the Houston Tap and Brazoria Railway to Galveston made Galveston the number one cotton port in the world at the turn of from the 19th to 20th century. In the early 1900s, Galveston was the number one cotton port. And that cotton went on to the city of Manchester in England and launched the Industrial Revolution. And so we can interpret a lot of modern history from this railroad and that plantation economy into the industrial economy. And more locally for this region, it informs a lot about race relations and labor, in addition to the construction pre-Civil War by enslaved people. During the Civil War, the rail was melted and turned into ammunitions. The Confederate Army No. 1 didn't want the Union to take over the rail, and so they disassembled it and then they used that for ammunitions. And then after the Civil War, of course, the plantation economy was struggling. So they hatched up this plan called convict lease labor, where the plantations would rent prisoners from the prisons around Houston and East Texas, and they were transported physically on the railroad back to the plantations. And so it tells a lot about the history of the U.S., but also the history of the Industrial Revolution. And that's really, I think, what Naomi has done a good job of piecing together those pieces and telling that story.
Thanks.
Okay, so I know that the history of the trail kind of led to bad infrastructure such as bad signage or bad lighting on the trail. Can you kind of talk about what issues that created for the residents of the Third Ward and near the trail? And also, can you kind of mention how, you mentioned in previous interviews how hard it is for the Third Ward residents to kind of make their concerns heard and go to council, because it often involves taking up an entire afternoon of their very busy lives. So can you kind of talk about how that inaccessibility plays into the kind of broader issues of inequality that these residents are facing, and also just what the neglected infrastructure, what kinds of problems that the neglected infrastructure causes for these residents as well?
I think the city made one big mistake when they started planning this rail trail in the early 1990s. They made the decision to acquire it through condemnation and place it on the inventory of Houston Public Works. Maybe because of the fact that it was a railway, and so they thought transportation. Maybe because they thought one day they might put light rail down it. I'm not really sure about that. But I do know that when they launched the first major section of the trail in 2009, the Public Works representative at the time said, "Congratulations, we've done our part. We've laid the cement. Now it's up to you guys to decide what the future is." So the Public Works has always taken a hands-off approach. Public Works focuses on roads and streets and drainage, on concrete and pipes. They don't have a linear park department. And I think folks think that a city and its departments are just kind of one cohesive ecosystem. It's not like that. They each have their own turfs. They each have their own inventories, their own staff attorneys and real estate managers. Even property doesn't get like collaborated on and transferred between them easily. So Public Works has had kind of a loose agreement with the Parks Department to mow it, but Parks Department can't unilaterally put in a park bench or a water fountain or even plant trees without going back to the Public Works Department for permission. And when we as residents try to initiate things, they would kind of point fingers at each other. Public Works, number one, wouldn't even have a person for us to talk to. They would say, go to the permitting center and talk to the people at the front desk about what you want to do. And of course, that's not going to go anywhere. And when we went to the Parks Department, they said, it's not our property. It's not a park. And so we reached out to the Houston Parks Board when we were first forming Friends of Columbia TAP in 2022, because actually the Houston Parks Board was part of that Healthy Outdoor Communities Coalition. And at the time, the Parks Board employee who was on that coalition was the one who recommended that we form this Friends of group so that we could access the Parks Board's neighborhood partnership program. And I think for the listeners, I need to point out I'm talking about two different entities when I talk about Parks and Recreation Department and Houston Parks Board. Houston Parks Board is a very unique entity in that it's a 501c3 nonprofit on one side, but on the other side it's a local government corporation or an LGC, which means that it's been granted municipal powers. It can go out and plan and implement infrastructure and maintain city property and right-of-way without going through city departments. They can also raise their own private funding, donor funding, that doesn't get put into the general fund of the city and all the limitations that comes with that. So they're a very powerful entity in Houston. We have over 25 or so local government corporations. Tax increment zones are a type of local government corporation under that umbrella. Anyways, I went to the Parks Board and said, how do we apply for a neighborhood partnership program? And they sent a terse email back months later saying the Columbia TAP is not a park. And that kind of set me off on this huge journey of figuring out, well, then what the heck is it? And the biggest breakthrough was when Joy Sewing, a journalist with the Chronicle, did an article about why has the Columbia Tap Trail been neglected. And I actually specifically wanted her to cover the story. And I had waited to convince her to take this story on because I knew that she had previously worked at the Parks Department. And I thought, finally, this might be someone that folks at the city might listen to, because it's not just Ed out there, complaining at city council. It's a former Parks employee who's now a journalist digging into how this all came about. And because of that article, we were finally able to get Public Works and Parks Department to sit down and at least communicate with our group about planning and implementing projects and going out and seeking funding. And now the Parks Department, now the Public Works Department has designated someone at Public Works to be the point person for the trail. So that this has all taken a lot of effort, like you said, going to city council meetings, which require you sometimes to take an entire afternoon. You get there at 1 o'clock. They have an hour of doing different kind of recognition ceremonies. Then at 2 o'clock you start. And sometimes if you have a lot of speakers, it can take 3 or more hours to get through the speakers, and you're never quite sure where you are on the list. And, meetings with council members, meetings with government staff. I mean, this takes a lot of time and effort from residents. And so I can understand why some residents, they get jaded about city processes and they just don't have that time and effort to go out and fight these fights.
Well, I think that gets back to just time is a luxury not everyone can afford.
Exactly.
Right? Communities that, as you're pointing to, are the most strapped for resources, that very much extends to time.
It does. And I should say that was a big reason why I left my work in the medical center and moved to more of a academic, self-employed mix of things, just so that I had a little bit more control over my schedule, because I was taking days off work. And I know people that do this today, community advocates, they take time off of their paid employed work to go out and do this kind of work. And it just wasn't sustainable for me. So I had to, no more, 9-to-5 jobs for me. So I had to have a little bit more flexibility.
I want to go back for a second. You had mentioned that the city kind of took charge of Columbia Tap in the early 2000s.
Yes.
And so I'm fascinated by, it seems like there was before that community engagement around recognizing we have to be responsible for this area, we care about this area. So do you think that was the city following that activism, that work around the area, or was it just a realization of we haven't done anything with this land and we have land and we should do something? But I'm curious what prompted, this sounds fairly limited engagement in the early 2000s with the space before maybe some broader engagement coming as a result of local groups really coalescing.
That's a very interesting history, and there wasn't a lot of coalescing. So that's a little spoiler alert. You saw a lot of disparate efforts that produced what we have today. But I'll go back to that initial citizen, what I call tactical urbanism work, even though in the 1980s that probably wasn't a term. But today we would call it tactical urbanism, where you kind of take initiative as citizens to address the failures of urban planning through low-cost, temporary, scalable projects. And the project at the time was abating this section of the trail south of McGregor, of Brays Bayou, that was being used by fraternities for parties. People were dumping vehicles and trash back there. There were crimes of people breaking into the backyards of people's homes along that empty section of the railroad. And one resident in particular, Michael Lee, who is an architect, he took it upon himself to start gardening back there. That was his form of therapy. At the time, as a gay man, a lot of his friends were dying of AIDS. And this was the 1980s, at the height of the epidemic in the U.S., and he started gardening as a form of therapy. And he put up a nice little fence to block people from driving back there. He planted all kinds of native and flowering trees and plants. He also used the drainage ditches, those same drainage ditches I said were a divider, as a place to plant bald cypresses, which formed a canopy that now has allowed this very mature wetland undergrowth. And we would call those bioswales. He calls them wattles, but in the kind of sciencey realm, we call them bioswales. And these are very mature bioswales that filter the water before it reaches Brays Bayou now. And it's a very beautiful garden. He's still going at it 40 years later, gardening back there. But when the city came in the early 2000s, the city called his garden an encroachment. Of course, it was never approved by Union Pacific. Union Pacific didn't care. They didn't care about that corridor in general. But they left it vacant. But when the city bought it, the city saw it as an encroachment. They didn't see it as a beautiful garden. And there were other resident efforts at the time focused on the trail aspect. So there was a developer who's still active today by the name of Alan Atkinson. And he was part of this group of residents in the 1990s that were very big on creating off-street paths and trails for cyclists to use to get around Houston. And sometimes he would also use his own form of tactical urbanism to start those trails and then hope that the city would come in and fill them in. And when the city came up with their plan for the Columbia Tap, Michael Lee was infuriated because he didn't want them destroying his garden. He actually took the city to court and claiming that he had a right to that garden through, in the name, the term is slipping my mind, but through this rule that if you maintain a vacant space for long enough, even a vacant lot, you get some ownership protections over it. And when he claimed that through court, he actually got a partial settlement, and so they gave him part of that right-of-way and extended his backyard a bit. But eventually the city came through. But to kind of avoid the city prolonging these kind of court cases, you had Alan Atkinson come in and actually do that section of the trail through the garden, which ended up being a blessing for Michael because Alan, I think, was more sympathetic to the garden than the city was at the time. And so that's why that's the only section of the Columbia Tap that kind of weaves in and out, because he was protecting those mature bald cypress trees and other statuary and things that were in the garden. So it's actually the most beautiful section of the trail today. It's also the most shaded, cool section of the trail. And it was kind of a combination of Michael the gardener, Alan Atkinson the trail builder, kind of finding this middle ground with the city. But I can't say that any three of those entities were working together in any kind of cohesive way. It was more of a give and take from all the sides that led to what we have now. But I think now everyone can see how this is working together for the betterment of the community. Adverse possession is the term that I was thinking of. So that was kind of Michael's thought, was that after, at the time, 20 years of taking care of this garden, I have some rights through adverse possession. And like I said, he did get a little bit of a settlement there, but his biggest concern was always keeping that as a garden. And the city didn't actually officially recognize that garden until a year and a half ago. The very last meeting of Mayor Turner's administration, he gave a proclamation to Michael, officially recognized that garden. So it was no longer an encroachment. It was recognized by the city.
So I can see Neman is ready to jump in with questions all about what's going on with the trail now, and I'm going to let you get to that in just a second. But I do want to point out, I love how incredibly Houston the story is,
Yeah.
just in terms of individuals enacting their own will to some extent,
Exactly.
kind of urban design by guerrilla tactic.
Yeah.
It is such a remarkably Houston experience, and also I think really fascinating to see what can be done at that individual level. What you're describing, has echoes of the very deliberate design or redesign of Buffalo Bayou and
Right.
the park preserve there, thinking about, to your point, trees provide canopy, they provide shade, right? These are things we do think about in our park spaces, is how can those bioswales function? How can they help retain water? How can they help purify that water? And so, what you're seeing is a kind of organic approach from homegrown urbanism, from homegrown care for space in a way that feels in this rather unregulated place in this, somewhat free-for-all of urbanity that we often imagine Houston to be, that there are interesting places where those uncared for spaces, if we approach that with a measure of care and consideration, can lead to really interesting outcomes. So I love the framing of this story as something seemingly so
Right.
uniquely Houston.
Well, and just another little tactical urbanism story. Before I even met Michael Lee or Alan Atkinson, back when I was living off the trail and trying to, make it better, in 2017, we had a church group come to Houston for a massive youth conference, and they were looking for projects to do. And so I wanted to propose that they put in some signage on the Columbia Tap Trail because, number one, not only did we not have any interpretive signage, we had no wayfinding signage, and lots of intersections had no safety signage of who was supposed to stop or yield cars or bicyclists. There was no signage whatsoever. And so I reached out to the Parks Department. I also wrote a grant to LISC, Local Initiative Services Corporation, Local Initiative Support Corporation. And I got the funding, but Parks Department wouldn't give me permission because, of course, they pointed to Public Works. And Public Works just wouldn't answer emails or questions about the Columbia Tap at all. And so I got stuck. And so I decided to go forward with a tactical urbanism approach and use temporary contractor paint, spray paint, and TXRX Labs helped me make stencils, and we stenciled the names of the street intersections along the trail and historical sites, and with little arrows pointing where to turn to see Emancipation Park or historic markers at TSU, things like that. And that was a very successful project that eventually led the city to go back in and put in actual street crossing signs and safety signage. The city never worked with us on the historic signage, the bigger stuff, because the street signage, that's something that Public Works understands more, right? So they were able to collaborate and get like stop signs and like signs that say you're crossing Elgin or McGowan. But when it came to like historical signage, Parks Department didn't have the authority to do it. Public Works didn't have the will to do it or the skill set to do it. We didn't get that done until actually this past year and a half. But we did that tactical urbanism project in 2017 that was at least a step in the right direction. And I think the whole history of the trail and the work we've done is residents kind of going out there doing it first through tactical or what some will call guerrilla urbanism, without permission really. And the funny thing is that our previous planning director under Margaret Wallace Smith, she has went on a speaking circuit after retirement talking about the benefits of tactical guerrilla urbanism tactics and how, she couldn't officially condone them as planning director, but now that she's retired, she said, we actually learned a lot from residents going out and doing these little pop-up projects. And we were able to take a lot of them and inform our future decisions and infrastructure.
That's funny. We've had Margaret on the show before, and she was wonderful. I do love the fact that it feels to some degree like the city wanted you to go out and do almost proof of concept for them.
Right.
Some of this, which
exactly.
Feels like it may not be the most productive use of resources and time, but it is an approach.
Right. So regarding city recognition of the TAP, there's been a large effort from you guys in terms of pushing the Columbia Taps Trail designation as both a linear park and also as an African American heritage trail. Can you kind of explain why that designation is so important for the community, both practically but also symbolically?
So practically, it was important because going back to what I was saying before, there was no agreement between Public Works and the Parks Department about how the trail should be managed. Another breakthrough that came was when we finally got the two management districts that have a footprint over the majority of the trail to collaborate and be interested in working with it. And this has probably been a whole podcast before, but the way that Houston does development is very piecemeal, and we have so many entities that perform municipal functions. I already mentioned the local government corporations like the Houston Parks Board and the tax increment reinvestment zones, which capture tax increment from new development within a certain boundary and can use that money for improving the infrastructure. And then you have management districts that have their authority coming from the state of Texas to levy additional fees on either residents or businesses or both that can use that for maintenance and beautification projects and public safety projects. And then you also have the city divided up by super neighborhoods and council districts. And the Columbia Tab, its little 4-mile trail, goes through dozens of these jurisdictions. And so it's very difficult to get all of these players on board. But we were able to finally get the Greater Houston Southeast Management District and the East Downtown Management District on board with this vision for the trail. And it was actually the management districts that reached out to Houston Galveston Area Council and were able to get us our first major funding last year to the tune of $7.5 million to do safety and infrastructure upgrades on the trail. And so that's in Houston, what makes things official is money. Like literally. Like once we have money, then the city will give permits, and then they'll be willing to work with you, and they'll care about your plans. And so when I think that people finally saw all the work we've done over the past 40 years, and actually it goes back further than that. I need to get to that next. But after the past 40 years of the tactical urbanism, the city finally saw it get to the point where these residents aren't going away. Let's work with the management districts and give them the support to go out and get the big funding to actually implement some of this stuff that the residents have been planning for. So that really was the big breakthrough.
You need to run off to class, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't you head out and I'll wrap up.
Okay.
We've still got some
No worries.
time, but she's got to run. I'm just gonna make a quick note.
Sorry, I'm so bad at speaking today.
You're fine.
Midterms have me everywhere.
Thanks. It was good
Thank you
meeting
for
you.
the interview. Yes, it was so nice to meet you.
So to follow up on that, I think, and part of the reason I wanted to have you on was there's some exciting developments coming up for the Columbia TAP, and that's involved both the new funding, congratulations, but it also involves broader projects that are starting to be imagined, more community buy-in from different kinds of partners along the trail. So can you tell us a little about where the TAP is heading, what these new projects are looking like, who some of these new partners who are getting invested are, and what the future of these projects might be?
So a couple of years ago, we started holding community coffee chats, initially in Doshi House Cafe in 3rd Ward. We eventually grew out of the private room at Doshi House and moved over to the Ratto Market, a new cafe on the first floor of the recently renovated El Dorado Ballroom. And we started kind of scheming about what we wanted to see done on the trail. And I had already worked with a group out of the University of Houston led by Susan Rogers called the Community Design Resource Center back when they were working on our Complete Communities action plans. And actually a lot of this work that we did on the Columbia TAP came out of that work, that resident-led work about complete communities. I won't get into how the city handled complete communities, but the residents who actually informed the action plans, we put a lot of time and effort into making those plans and to trying to find the funding our own selves to implement some of those things. And we finally had enough funding together that we could basically contract with the UH Community Design Resource Center to come up with a plan for the trail. And so we held a series of workshops and charrettes, very interactive, at the 3rd Ward Multi-Service Center that informed what became our Columbia TAP action plan. After that, we actually got additional funding from Verizon to do a second plan on housing and economic opportunity. And when we presented some of this visioning work and some of the findings of this work at a Texas architects conference here that was held in Houston about a year and a half ago, we met a gentleman in the audience who during Q&A raised his hand and introduced himself as Mr. James Jimmy Walker II. And Mr. Jimmy Walker was actually the first African American to graduate from the architecture school at UH. And he said, "I'm so glad to see what you're doing because I proposed turning what was then the Columbia Tap Railroad into a linear park in my 1973 Model Cities plan for 3rd Ward." And that's a plan that I had actually seen, and I had never realized that the author was still here, active and working on this over 50 years later. And so now Mr. Walker is a regular attendee of our coffee chats. And so now he's 50 years later finally seeing the fruits of this plan that he wrote in 1973. And so we're very excited about that. But thanks to the work from UH, from the collaboration with the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice, where I serve as a graduate research assistant at TSU. They helped us with our affordable housing dashboard for that housing and economic part of the trail plan. We're starting to have actionable projects that now we can fulfill with this funding from HGAC and other sources.
Can you say a little bit more about those, just in terms of what that would mean, if these projects come to fruition for the community? Because you're talking about affordable housing, but you're also talking about taking essentially what is a resource of sorts, but also an underutilized or maybe unfulfilled resource.
Mm-hmm.
What would it look like for this space? And it's about 4 miles, right? And so
Correct.
For this 4 mile space to suddenly transform, what would that mean for neighborhoods and communities along the area? What would it mean for those residents, and how would it impact and transform their lives?
Well, I'll start with the number one recommendation that we received from residents through those workshops.
Mm-hmm.
The number one recommendation was lighting. They wanted lighting because they did not feel safe using the trail when the sun started to go down. And they didn't want it to be a vacant corridor that just leads to crimes of opportunity. And this is something that Jane Jacobs wrote about in The Life and Death of Great American Cities, that when you don't have eyes on the street, or in our case, eyes on the trail, that really is what leads to crime and decay. And that's what we saw. Those sections of the trail that were surrounded by vacant lots, that were dark, that's where crimes were happening. That's where people didn't feel safe. And, you would have certain sections that people would just do U-turns and just wouldn't go down. And from time to time, fortunately, we haven't had kind of random crime, but we've had organized crime that would pop up now and then, spaced apart by a number of years, but would kind of always kind of creep up again. And so lighting was really the number one recommendation. Number two was more trees. So under the HGAC funding, lighting will be kind of the first thing that they put in, and the goal is to have it put in before the World Cup in 2026 next year. Another big piece of this HGAC funding is going to be extending the south terminus of the trail. Right now, the trail dead ends at Dixie Drive. And a long time ago, Grocer's Supply bought up the old rail right-of-way, and that's why the trail couldn't continue any further. Now that Grocer's Supply property has been bought up by Heinz as part of their Levitt Green development, and that's kind of halfway finished now, but it's a mixed-use development that's tied in with the medical center. So there's nowhere for the trail really to go further south, but you can follow Dixie Drive and take you to Alameda, where Precinct 1, through Commissioner Rodney Ellis, over the past couple of years, has connected that trail that goes through that part of Herman Park all the way to Holly Hall and to NRG, and he calls it the Rodeo Trail. So that section along Dixie Drive, which will hopefully be an off-street shared use path, will be covered under the $7.5 million. The other thing I really want to see, although I don't know how much we can stretch those funds, because when you do big municipal projects with big municipal contractors, $7.5 million all of a sudden isn't a lot, even though it's a lot for us that we're doing things with a couple $100 here and there. But my vision and goal and priority is to see those smaller connections within the community of all these dead-end residential streets, connecting them with pocket parks and trail connections. And we have a proof of concept for that at Truxillo, which is how folks in Third Ward pronounce Trujillo. But Truxillo dead ends at CUNY Homes to the trail. And the residents of CUNY Homes for years called that dead end the gun range. You would literally have gangs taking kids out and doing shooting practice into the embankment of the trail at that dead end. It was also a hot spot for illegal dumping. There would always be a white van parked out there dealing drugs. And this was kind of openly known by the city and the housing authority, but for years they didn't do anything. So we worked with one of the Houston Housing Authority staff who was over the Third Ward CUNY Homes Choice Neighborhood Revitalization Project, which was a HUD-funded project in the planning phase at the time, to clean up that dead end. As soon as we cleaned it up and did some very basic landscaping, the white van left, the illegal dumping left. We know the residents no longer heard shootings out there. And we took that and we were able to get additional funding to make it into a proper park with ADA accessible ramp up to the trail across to the other side. And residents had already been trying to get across because there's a washateria laundromat on the other side of the trail. And when it rained, they would literally have to take cinder blocks and old boards and make their own bridge to get across a drainage ditch. So that pocket park, if you go there today, there's guys out there playing chess at one of the tables. There's solar lighting. There's people with their walker and their wheelchairs getting up to the trail and across to the other side. There's kids using it to go to school. We need to see more of that along the trail so that the Third Ward residents are actually connected and have access to the trail.
Great. Well, we are rapidly approaching the end of our time here. Is there anything else that you need to let us know that we should know about Columbia Tap before we call it?
I would say that we always have volunteer opportunities. We're always mobilizing around different issues. Definitely, I think we could spend a whole show talking about affordable housing and housing plans. You know, a big piece of that is working with the folks who own the land. And the two biggest landowners of vacant lots in Third Ward are the Midtown Redevelopment Authority, which is currently undergoing a massive investigation for fraud and will likely have their board replaced by the mayor in the near future. And then the other big component is owned by churches who have purchased up this vacant land that is tax exempt for years. And we're now working with some of them, like Trinity East United Methodist Church, to transform that into affordable housing. So that's kind of the next chapter, because we want to get the housing stable. Also working with Rebuilding Together Houston that preserves already existing what they call naturally affordable occurring housing. We did a project where we worked with Rebuilding Together Houston to renovate the home of an elderly man who lives right on the trail. And he literally sits down on his porch waving to everyone who passes by. Exactly what Jane Jacobs says creates healthy communities, mixed income, mixed age, intergenerational communities where you have folks sitting on their porch waving to kids passing by. Like, that's what creates healthy communities. And you can't have that without housing. So that's really our priority. And that's a lot of what we discuss at our Friday coffee chats every Friday, 10 a.m. at the Ratto Market, 2310 Elgin Street. So please join us, get plugged in, volunteer, give your professional skills and resources. It takes the whole community to realize this vision.
Well, Ed Pettitt, thank you so much for your time and for joining us. It's been a delight talking to you.
Thank you.
Now we'll go over to our researcher, Sophia, who has a new piece in her Critter Corner series for us.
Hi everyone, it's Sophia, and welcome back to Critter Corner, where we dive into Houston's fascinating wildlife. In each episode, we feature experts and enthusiasts who share their favorite local flora and fauna, the role in our ecosystem, and ways that we can all support our community's biodiversity. In this episode, we're joined by Carla Clay, the founding director of Artist Boat with over 30 years of experience in arts and environmental education, and who led the way to conserve over 1,000 acres on Galveston Island. Welcome to the show, Carla.
Hi, thank you, Sophie.
Of course. So to start off, can you tell me a bit about yourself and the work that you do?
I'm Carla Clay. I'm the executive director of the Artist Boat. At Artist Boat, we integrate art and science through 6 different programs to teach people about marine environments and coastal margins, from eco-art kayak adventures to in-school residency programs. Everyone produces some kind of artwork to translate knowledge about the environment. They're as simple as little watercolors to like permanent murals or mosaics, or trash barrels on the beach that are painted with trash messages, things like that. My work is mostly as the executive director, fundraising, grant writing, and making sure we can pay all our bills, but also that we have the staff to deliver our programs.
Well, thank you for sharing about some of the fascinating work that you do, and I'm super excited to dive in with you today. So with that, can you tell us what species you're talking about today and why it's special to you?
My favorite animal that's not human that I've made friends with is a bottlenose dolphin. So I grew up in the Florida Keys. My dad was a shark biologist, and we had shark pens in the Gulf of Mexico, and he shipped sharks all around the world and kept them alive in captivity. And next door to us was Flipper Sea School, which is now the Dolphin Research Center. And so I've been friends with dolphins since I can remember anything. And they're very intelligent. They all have different personalities and likes and dislikes. And one dolphin, who is the star in the movie The Big Blue, Nachua, I was very close to my whole childhood. And when I was older, I went back and did a summer internship at the Dolphin Research Center, and Nachua always knew who I was, and everybody say, "Oh, Nachua has a great affinity towards you," which I already knew. But I think we learn a lot from other mammals and friendships with other species because there are languages way older than words, and those languages are intuitive to all animals. But if you wanted to know about bottlenose dolphins, I could also tell you more about them as a being, like how they work and their senses and all of that.
Yeah, I would love to hear about that. And that sounds like a really special experience that you got to share. So I'm wondering, are bottlenose dolphins at all native to Galveston Bay or other close areas of the Gulf of Mexico?
Oh, yeah. So they're a very coastal species. Most of our bays on the Gulf of Mexico have a resident population of bottlenose dolphins. We also have populations of bottlenose dolphins in the Gulf of Mexico. But for example, in Galveston Bay, I think over 3,000 individuals have been identified here after the oil spill in Barataria-Terrebonne estuary. There have been no successful live dolphin births because of all the damage done to the population from the oil spill. And people think, why don't they leave? It's polluted. But they grew up there. That's their home. And they know that the bottlenose dolphins of different bays are very faithful to those bays. So like Tampa Bay has a population. We have a population here. Down in Corpus, Aransas Pass has a population. And they live in matriarchal family groups. And the boys disperse when they get older and have to find a new family to hang out with.
What role does the bottlenose dolphin play in Galveston Bay's ecosystem as well as the many other areas then that they can be found?
Well, the bottlenose dolphin is a top predator, so they can eat what they want. They also need a lot of food, so they probably might be perceived by fishermen to compete for food. But they're definitely a top predator, eating, fish in quite an abundant amount. Of course, they're also very good for tourism because, you can sustain a dolphin watch vessel and people will pay to go see the dolphins in the ship channel or wherever. Well, they see them in the ship channel. Here is the best place to see them.
Yeah, and you've already shared a lot of interesting facts about this species, but what is one extra surprising fact about the bottlenose dolphin that you especially find interesting and that people might not know?
Oh, well, I think they're fascinating. One, they're conscious breathers. All marine mammals have to decide when to take a breath. So I always tell people, imagine if every time you just needed to breathe, you had to decide to breathe. That's a lot of attention to pay attention to yourself to breathe. So they have to be very smart. Also, with their sonar, they can send, scientists believe that they sonar something, they send out sound, they get an image back. Now, it won't be the image like we see in our eyes. And that image, they suspect that they can send it to another bottlenose dolphin. So it would be like I went to the restaurant and was like, "Hey, Sophie, look at my lasagna." And I sent you mentally an image of my lasagna. And then you'd be like, "Hey, I want to go to that restaurant." So they're conveying a lot of knowledge through their sonar to each other about the environment. And then they can stun fish with the sonar. And then also they have what's called a click train, a whistle. So they each have a name and they know each other's names and can tell each other their names.
Wow, that's super interesting. Sounds
Yeah.
like a lot of research is being done on these bottlenose dolphins.
Oh,
And
more and more every day. Yeah.
yeah, which is great. And with that, I'm wondering what are some simple ways that people can support the species, either through funding research or through local initiatives or anything like that?
Well, they could donate money to the marine mammal stranding networks in their state. Like in Texas, we have the Texas Marine Mammal Stranding Network. So if a dolphin is injured, they respond. If a dolphin is dead, they take a necropsy, which gives us more information about what could be happening. Anything you can do to reduce sound in the water. Sound travels 7 times faster or 3 times faster in water than air. And so, like, any way you can reduce sound in the ocean helps all marine mammals. Also, we have to remember every chemical that we apply to our yard, to our gardens, runs off the land during a rain event, enters the water, enters the food web. And so they're finding a lot of PCBs and other chemicals and plastics, microplastics in the dolphins, which means they're ingesting it as the food travels up the food web, it bioaccumulates in the fish that the dolphins are eating. So any reduction in pollution is paramount to the health of marine mammals. And air quality is also important because when they breathe, they are exchanging a lot more air than we do because they pull in all the air, they go underwater, and they hold their breath for a long time. So I can't remember the exact amount of exchange, but like a bird exchanges almost 100% of its air every time it breathes. A bottlenose dolphin, I don't remember the percent, but it's a lot more than we do because we can just breathe at our leisure. We don't have to think about it.
Thank you so much for sharing those tips and information about the bottlenose dolphin. I think a lot of the ways we can help are very easy and practical, but not everyone knows about them. So it's super important that you came on here and talked to us. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and for everyone listening, thanks for tuning in and make sure to come back soon to learn more about these fascinating local species.
That's our show for today. A quick reminder that if you have questions or ideas you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder, you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. And if you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Co-produced by Joseph Campana. Audio engineer Rico Enriquez. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Jaden Bray Boyce, Sophia Soltez, and Naman Rinchdorf. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.